Sir Edward, you signed it without question as well, didn't you?
Indeed, and I apologise for that.
The issues raised in your letter are, however, operational and contractual matters between Post Office Limited and Mrs Henderson, and I should make clear that neither I nor the department can intervene in cases which are sub judice or where court action had been determined, essentially consistent with your evidence this afternoon. However, it goes on. I understand that Mrs Henderson was charged to appear at Norwich Crown Court on the 15th of December 2010. I further understand that she pleaded guilty to false accounting, Paul having dropped a charge of theft, and the court imposed a sentence of a community penalty order with unpaid work of 200 hours and £1,500 costs. Mrs Henderson also repaid the shortage, and I understand at no time during the case were any problems with Paul's Horizon IT system raised by Mrs Henderson or separately identified. So in this case, in Mrs Henderson's letter, it does comment on an individual case. It gives the circumstances of her pleading guilty and moreover goes on to say that she didn't say anything about Horizon. Do you accept that, Sir Ed?
That's what it says in the letter.
Indeed. And would you accept that the comment has the effect of saying that, well, while Mrs Henderson may be alluding to the unreliability as the cause of her problems in the letter to you, Mr Norman Bell MP, she didn't do so in the proceedings against her when it really mattered?
Well, I assume when my officials drafted that, that was what they had in their mind, yes.
Yeah. And you'd accept, would you, that such a comment would be likely to undermine the trust that Norman Lamb, her MP, might have in her sincerity?
Yeah, I feel very sorry for Mrs Henderson and frankly all the sub-postmasters and misters who've been so badly affected by this miscarriage of justice, and this clearly would not have helped.
No. Now, I asked you at the start whether, whilst officials wrote letters for you, would you sometimes raise things if you thought you might have to be careful about things and so on? Did you raise anything in this instance?
No, I didn't.
Why would such a point-scoring comment be included in a letter from your department, essentially saying, look, this woman is complaining about Horizon, but when she went to court, she didn't? Why would a comment, a point-scoring comment of that nature, be included in a letter from your department?
I don't know.
It might be viewed, mightn't it, as siding with Post Office?
It can certainly be interpreted that way, absolutely.
Did you think at the time that it was right to send a letter like that?
I generally can't remember, I can't recall signing this letter. And if it gave offence to Mrs Henderson, I apologise to her.
Right. Do you know where that information came from about her not saying anything about Horizon?
No.
No. Well, can we just please look at the judgment of the Court of Appeal Criminal Division in the case of Hamilton and others, which is POL 20113-278. Here we are. And could we scroll up just a bit so that we can see what's beneath that paragraph as well? That will really help. Thank you, that's perfect. The appellant, Alison Henderson, pleaded guilty to false accounting and Paul offered no evidence on a charge of theft. Before agreement was reached to that effect, Paul's prosecuting lawyer gave instructions to counsel that a plea to false accounting on the basis that Horizon was at fault would not be acceptable. In her case, it's conceded that it was improper to make the acceptability of her basis of plea conditional on her making no issue of Horizon. And since the theft charge had been dropped, Post Office could no longer advance a case that she'd stolen any money, and it should have been open to her to suggest that there was no actual loss and she'd only covered up a shortfall created by Horizon. If we could then move forward 6 pages, please, to paragraphs 156. Here we see more details in relation to Mrs Henderson's case. There are the circumstances of her plea, as reflected in your letter. At 157, we see that, in fact, Mrs Henderson denied theft, and this is 5 lines in. Denied theft, but accepted that she was contractually obliged to make good any discrepancies was making efforts to do so. In an amended signed defence statement served on the 16th of November 2010, Mrs Henderson said that it was her belief that any discrepancy, quote, was a result of a malfunction of the Horizon computerised accounting system. Any discrepancy could have been discovered by the Post Office auditor, and so on. If we go further down, please, so that records what was in her defence statement and gives the lie to what was said in your letter just from the outset, as it were, Sir Edward. We then see, though, in paragraph 159, that at the end of September 2010, Mr Wilson wrote to an investigator essentially saying that a plea on the basis of Horizon unreliability would not be acceptable. If we could go down to the next paragraphs, please. And at 160, he says it in terms, clearly, if there were to be a plea to false accounting, but on the basis that Horizon system is at fault, then that would not be an acceptable basis of plea for the prosecution. And then there is discussion. It was absolutely plain that Mrs Henderson was raising Horizon all the way through this case. And what was in your letter was a complete travesty, you can see now, can't you?
What you've shown me is quite shocking.
Yep.
Clearly, I was asked to sign a letter which is clearly wrong. I didn't know that at the time. I believed the letter to be true.
Plainly, the only checks that were done were with Post Office, weren't they?
It looks that way.
And Post Office did not tell the officials the truth, did they? It can't have done, can they?
From what you've shown me, they can't have done.
But it looks like officials were more than happy, without question, to include a completely untruthful slur on Mrs Henderson in the letter in order to undermine her position.
It looks that way.
Yeah. And, Sir Edward, you signed it without question as well, didn't you?
Indeed, and I apologise for that. I have to say, when you are signing letters, you are working on the basis that people are telling you the truth. Yeah. That's the only way that government can work. It's one of the reasons why we need a duty of candour. Yeah. It is shocking that people have misled ministers, misled sub-postmasters above all.
I'm sure you can, but can you understand the hurt that must have caused Mrs Henderson?
Of course I can, and I apologise to her.
And I ask you this question about the more general statement you've just made. Was it appropriate, is it appropriate for a department to only go to, for example, Post Office for information when it's Post Office that is being challenged?
Well, I think what comes through what you've just shown me is that I think if departments are quoting court cases, they should go back to the court case.
Thank you, sir.